He owned villas along the glittering coast, lent money to emperors, and dined at tables soaked in gold. Yet he told the world that wealth was a moral danger. 2,000 years later, his words still whisper in the ears of billionaires and monks alike. How did the richest philosopher of Rome become the loudest preacher of poverty? And was he a hypocrite or something far more unsettling? Stay with me, because once you step into Seneca's world, it becomes very hard to leave. Before we begin this journey, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these long, documentary-style stories reach the people who love history as much as you do. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, or what you do for a living. Seneca believed knowing how others live was essential to wisdom, so let's honor that idea together. The man who would one day lecture emperors about self-control entered the world already marked by fragility. Lucius Annaeus. Seneca was born around 4 BCE in Cordoba, a provincial city far from the marble heart of Rome. It was not an insignificant place, but it was not where destinies were usually forged. His family, however, was unusual. His father, Seneca the Elder, was a celebrated rhetorician, one of those men who believed words could shape reality itself. In Rome, eloquence was not decoration, it was survival. Courts, politics, patronage, even exile, were decided by how well a man could speak. From infancy, Seneca was surrounded by the idea that language was power, yet power did not protect his body. From early childhood, Seneca was sickly. Chronic respiratory illness, likely asthma or tuberculosis, made breathing a daily struggle. Ancient sources describe episodes so severe that he contemplated suicide simply to escape the pain. Imagine this paradox. A boy born into privilege, educated among Rome's finest minds, who could not trust his own lungs to keep him alive. Every breath was uncertain. Every night carried the quiet possibility of not waking. This constant proximity to death shaped him long before philosophy ever did. While other boys trained their bodies for public life, wrestling, riding, marching, Seneca learned stillness. He learned patience. He learned to observe. Weakness in Rome was not admired. It was dangerous. And so, from the beginning, Seneca learned to hide parts of himself. When his family moved to Rome, the contrast was overwhelming. The city was not merely large. It was alive in a way no provincial town could prepare you for. Rome smelled of sweat, incense, blood, and ambition. The forum pulsed with lawsuits and speeches. Senators glided through crowds like predators wrapped in silk. Slaves outnumbered citizens. Power was visible everywhere, and it was never gentle. For a young Seneca, Rome was both intoxicating and terrifying. His father immersed him in rhetorical training, drilling him in argument, persuasion, and memory. But Seneca's interests drifted elsewhere. While rhetoric taught him how to win, philosophy asked him something far more unsettling. What was worth winning at all? He gravitated toward Stoicism, but not the calm, simplified version quoted on social media today. Ancient Stoicism was severe. It demanded emotional discipline, indifference to fortune, and the acceptance of suffering as inevitable. To many, it sounded bleak. To a chronically ill boy in an unstable world, it sounded honest. Stoicism did not promise happiness. It promised resilience. At the same time, Seneca flirted with other philosophical schools. Pythagoreanism fascinated him, especially its emphasis on simplicity, vegetarianism, and self-restraint. For a period, he even practiced voluntary poverty, sleeping on hard surfaces, eating meager food, deliberately training himself to need less. This was not fashionable asceticism. It was preparation. Seneca was rehearsing for loss long before loss arrived, and loss in Rome always arrived. Despite his brilliance, Seneca's early political career stalled. He entered public life cautiously, aware that ambition could be fatal. Rome rewarded visibility and punished it just as quickly. Emperors rose and fell. Accusations appeared overnight. Friends became informants. Survival depended less on virtue than on timing. Under Emperor Caligula, this danger became immediate. Caligula was erratic, theatrical, and violently insecure. According to later accounts, Seneca once delivered a speech so eloquent that the emperor considered having him executed out of jealousy. Seneca survived only because Caligula was told the young man was already dying from illness and not worth the effort. Let that sink in. Seneca lived because he was considered too weak to matter. This moment lodged itself deep in his psyche. Talent could attract death. Excellence could provoke envy. Survival sometimes required appearing insignificant. From this point onward, Seneca's life would be a continuous negotiation between brilliance and invisibility. When Caligula was assassinated and Claudius took power, Rome did not become safer, only quieter. Claudius ruled through bureaucracy and suspicion, heavily influenced by palace intrigues. It was during this period that Seneca's fortunes reversed violently. Accused, likely falsely, of an affair with Julia Livilla, the emperor's niece, Seneca was condemned to exile on the island of Corsica. No trial of substance, no real defense. One day, he was a rising intellectual in Rome. The next, he was erased. Corsica was harsh, remote, and culturally barren by Roman standards. For a man raised on conversation, books, and debate, it was a kind of living death. Seneca was stripped of political relevance, social stimulation, and the illusion of control. All that remained was time and himself. This is where the paradox truly begins to form. Exile could have broken him. Many it did. Instead, Seneca wrote. He wrote letters of consolation, philosophical treatises, reflections on anger, grief, and endurance. These were not abstract exercises. They were survival tools. Philosophy became not a luxury, but a prosthetic for the soul. He learned something crucial in isolation. Suffering does not disappear when you resist it. It transforms when you understand it. Years passed. Rome forgot him. Or seemed to. But history, like Rome itself, has a habit of circling back. When Claudius's wife Agrippina rose to power, she needed a tutor for her son, Nero. She needed someone brilliant, respected, and politically neutral. Someone exiled, indebted, and eager to return. Seneca was summoned back to Rome. The man who had learned to live with nothing was about to receive everything. And that is where the real contradiction begins to tighten, slowly, dangerously, around his life. Rome did not announce itself gently. It overwhelmed. It pressed in from every direction. Stone, noise, heat, ambition, until a person either adapted or broke. When Seneca returned from exile, the city he stepped into was the same Rome he remembered, and yet not at all the same. Power had shifted hands. Alliances had rearranged themselves, and beneath the surface, the old truth remained unchanged. Rome devoured its own. To understand Seneca's paradox, you must first understand the organism he lived inside. Rome was not just a capital. It was a machine designed to convert human lives into spectacle, labor, and loyalty. Over 1 million people crowded within its walls. Slaves hauled water, cleaned streets, cooked meals, and died nameless deaths so that others could debate virtue in shaded porticos. Senators spoke of honor while bribing judges. Generals celebrated triumphs soaked in blood. Wealth flowed upward like gravity had reversed, pooling in the hands of the few while the many survived day to day. And yet, Rome was irresistible. It promised immortality through memory. To be known in Rome was to matter, to leave a trace, a law, a building, a sentence quoted generations later, was to defeat death itself. This was the unspoken contract Rome offered its elite. Give us your conscience, and we will give you permanence. Seneca knew this contract well. His father had chased it through rhetoric. His teachers had shaped their lives around it, and now, recalled from exile, Seneca was once again standing at the edge of Rome's gravitational pull. But he was no longer naive. He had seen how quickly Rome could erase a man. One accusation, one rumor, one imperial mood swing. Exile had taught him that status was not a possession. It was a loan, calable at any moment. This knowledge made him cautious, but it also made him valuable. In Rome, the most dangerous people were not the ambitious ones. They were the ones who understood danger and proceeded anyway. Claudius's Rome was a city ruled less by charisma than by paperwork and paranoia. The emperor himself was awkward, scholarly, and underestimated. Traits that did not protect him from manipulation. Behind the scenes, power belonged to those who controlled access: wives, freedmen, advisors. Rome had become a palace of corridors, where decisions were made quietly and lives ended without applause. Into this environment stepped Seneca, newly restored, carrying both humiliation and insight. He was appointed praetor, then quickly elevated further. But more importantly, he became something far rarer than an official, a moral asset. Seneca could speak the language of virtue in a city starving for justification. His Stoic framing allowed power to be described as duty, wealth as burden, and obedience as wisdom. This did not make him unique. Many philosophers played this role, but Seneca was exceptionally convincing. Rome rewarded him accordingly. Money arrived first, then land. Villas outside the city, estates in Italy and beyond. Loans extended at interest to provincial elites and even to members of the imperial circle. Ancient sources accuse him of amassing a fortune equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern terms. Whether exaggerated or not, the scale is undeniable. Seneca became one of the wealthiest men in the empire. And here the tension sharpens, because as Rome enriched him, Seneca was writing about the danger of enrichment. He wrote that wealth enslaves those who cling to it. That luxury dulls the soul. That true freedom belongs to the man who can lose everything without despair. These were not obscure notes scribbled in private. They circulated widely. They were read aloud. They shaped how educated Romans spoke about ethics. To many, this felt obscene. Rome tolerated excess, but it despised hypocrisy. Senators could be corrupt, generals brutal, emperors cruel. But preaching restraint while living in opulence triggered a deeper resentment. Seneca became a lightning rod for this discomfort. He was not merely rich. He was articulate about why riches didn't matter. And that, paradoxically, made his wealth more offensive. But Rome itself embodied this contradiction. The city worshipped simplicity in words and excess in practice. It honored ancient farmers and conquerors while living off slave labor and imperial plunder. Moral language was decoration, a way to soothe collective guilt. Seneca was not outside this system. He was one of its most refined expressions. What distinguished him was not that he possessed wealth, but that he seemed haunted by it. He understood something many Romans did not want to admit. Wealth did not bring security. It brought visibility, and visibility was lethal. The more Seneca owned, the more he had to lose. The more he was admired, the more he was watched. Every dinner invitation was political. Every gift implied obligation. Every public appearance was a performance calibrated to avoid envy. In Rome, you could not simply be rich. You had to manage the story of your wealth. Seneca tried to do this through philosophy. He argued that it was not wealth itself that corrupted, but attachment to it. A wise man could own riches without being owned by them. He compared money to a tool, useful but morally neutral. The problem, he insisted, was dependence. Critics were unconvinced. They asked why, if money was indifferent, Seneca kept so much of it. Why loan at interest? Why build villas? Why accept imperial favor at all? These questions echoed through Rome's salons and senate halls. Rarely spoken directly to his face, Seneca heard them anyway. And Rome ensured he could not ignore them, because Rome was never content to let contradictions remain theoretical. It forced them into action. It demanded loyalty when philosophy hesitated. It tested ideals with blood. The city itself seemed to whisper a warning. You cannot live above us. You must live within us. This was the Rome that raised Nero, a city of spectacle and cruelty, of crowds cheering executions, of theaters where emperors performed and audiences pretended to enjoy it. Nero absorbed Rome's contradictions instinctively. He learned that power was performance, that mercy could be staged, that philosophy could be recited without being lived. And Seneca, watching this, understood the danger. He was helping shape a future emperor inside a city that had perfected the art of moral compromise. His words would matter, but only until they interfered with desire. Rome did not kill philosophers for being wrong. It killed them for being inconvenient. As Seneca walked Rome's streets, passing temples funded by conquest and statues paid for, with taxes extracted from distant provinces, he faced an unspoken question that hovered over everything he wrote and owned. Could virtue survive inside an empire built on domination? He had not yet answered it, but Rome, relentless and patient, was already preparing the test. Silence was the most dangerous sound in Rome. In the Senate, silence meant you were being watched. In court, it meant you were losing. In the palace, it meant someone else had spoken first, and possibly against you. Rome was a civilization built on speech, but it was sustained by what went unsaid. Seneca learned this early, and he learned it well. His formal education had trained him to dominate rooms with words. Rhetoric was Rome's highest art form, and Seneca mastered it under the shadow of his father's reputation. He learned how to build arguments like architecture, foundations, pillars, symmetry, flourish. He learned how to bend emotion without appearing to touch it, how to persuade without seeming desperate, how to sound sincere even when navigating dangerous half-truths. But Rome did not reward the honesty. It rewarded plausibility. As Seneca rose, he became acutely aware that speech was never neutral. Every sentence carried risk. Praise could sound like mockery. Criticism could be treason. Even philosophy, especially philosophy, could be interpreted as political commentary. To speak of virtue in a corrupt city was to imply accusation. To speak of restraint near power was to challenge it. And yet, Seneca spoke. Not loudly, not recklessly, but persistently. He began writing essays that dissected human emotions with surgical calm. Anger, he argued, was the most destructive force in public life. Not cruelty, anger. Because anger masqueraded as justice. It convinced men they were righteous while committing irreversible acts. This was not an abstract observation. It was a diagnosis of Rome itself. In another work, he wrote about the shortness of life, not because life was brief, but because it was wasted. Romans, he said, spent their days chasing status, favors, and wealth, only to realize too late that none of it had been truly theirs. Time, unlike money, could not be reclaimed. These ideas circulated quietly at first. They were discussed in private villas, quoted in letters, murmured among educated elites who felt uneasy but trapped. Seneca's writing did something dangerous. It made people feel seen. And when people feel seen in an empire, someone eventually feels threatened. What made Seneca unique was not just what he said, but how he said it. His prose was sharp, rhythmic, intimate. He wrote as if speaking directly to one reader, pulling them aside from the noise of the city. This was revolutionary in a culture that valued public performance over private reflection. Seneca turned philosophy inward, and in doing so, he created a quiet rebellion. But he also created a problem for himself, because the more convincing his words became, the more his life was scrutinized against them. Rome had no patience for inconsistency dressed as wisdom. Philosophers were tolerated as long as they remained decorative, harmless critics who made vice feel sophisticated. Seneca, however, was becoming something else, a moral authority with proximity to power. That combination was volatile. Inside the imperial court, language was even more treacherous. Every compliment to Nero carried expectation. Every lesson implied judgment. Seneca had been tasked not just with educating a boy, but with shaping a future emperor's conscience. And he understood how fragile that task was. Nero was intelligent, sensitive, and deeply insecure. He craved admiration and feared irrelevance. Seneca saw in him both potential and danger. He tried to guide him toward Stoic restraint, toward the idea that true greatness lay in self-mastery, not domination. But Rome was whispering different lessons. The city rewarded spectacle. It celebrated excess. It cheered violence. Nero watched crowds roar at executions and performances alike. He learned that applause could absolve almost anything. Seneca's calm arguments about virtue had to compete with the intoxicating feedback loop of imperial power. So Seneca adapted his language. He softened admonitions into reflections. He framed restraint as elegance, mercy as strength, moderation as the mark of a superior soul. He avoided direct confrontation. He chose survival over purity. This was not cowardice, it was strategy. A dead philosopher teaches nothing. Still, the tension grew. Seneca began to sense that words alone could not restrain a system designed to erode conscience. Rome consumed language the way it consumed people, stripping it of meaning, turning it into ornament. Philosophy risked becoming another luxury item, admired but not obeyed. This realization unsettled him deeply. In private letters, he admitted doubts. He questioned whether teaching virtue inside a corrupt structure was self-deception, whether his own eloquence was enabling the very excess he criticized. These were not doubts he could voice publicly. Rome punished uncertainty more harshly than hypocrisy, and yet uncertainty shaped his thought. He began emphasizing internal freedom, the idea that while external circumstances might be uncontrollable, the mind remained sovereign. This was not a call to passivity. It was an attempt to carve out moral space in an environment that suffocated it. If Rome controlled bodies, perhaps philosophy could still liberate souls. But even this had limits, because Seneca knew that ideas do not exist in isolation. They are tested by action, and Rome was approaching a moment where words would no longer suffice. Nero was growing older. His power was solidifying. His patience for restraint was thinning. The boy who once listened was becoming an emperor who expected obedience. And Seneca, who had learned to speak surrounded by silence, now faced a more dangerous challenge. What happens when the listener stops listening? The answer was already forming in the shadows of the palace, waiting for the moment when philosophy would be asked to prove itself, not in ink, but in blood. Exile does something strange to time. Days stretch, nights linger. The noise of the world fades until a man is left alone with his own thoughts and discovers, often too late, that they are louder than any crowd. For Seneca, exile was not merely a punishment imposed by Rome. It was a confrontation staged by fate. Corsica was nothing like the Rome he had known. It was rugged, sparsely populated, and indifferent to ambition. There were no grand forums, no intellectual salons, no subtle games of power disguised as friendship. The island did not care who Seneca had been. It cared only whether he could endure. At first, he could not. The humiliation cut deep. Seneca had been trained for visibility, for influence, admiration, relevance. Exile stripped him of all three. Letters he sent to Rome often went unanswered. His name faded from conversation. The city moved on, as it always did. For a man who understood how easily Rome erased people, this was both confirmation and terror. And then there was the body. His illness worsened in isolation. Without Rome's physicians, comforts, and distractions, pain returned to the foreground. Breathing remained a struggle. Sleep was unreliable. Death felt close again, close enough to speak to. Seneca contemplated suicide more than once. This detail is often softened by later admirers, but it matters. Stoicism did not forbid suicide. It permitted it under conditions where life became incompatible with dignity or rational agency. Seneca knew the arguments intimately. He weighed them. He rehearsed them. What stopped him was not fear, but curiosity. If suffering was unavoidable, he wanted to understand it. So he turned exile into an experiment. He began to observe himself with the same analytical precision he applied to rhetoric. How did despair arise? What thoughts fed it? Which impulses intensified pain, and which loosened its grip? Philosophy ceased to be something he taught or admired. It became a survival mechanism. He wrote constantly. Letters of consolation flowed from his pen, some to real recipients, others almost certainly imagined. He wrote about grief, not as an abstract condition, but as a physical force that invaded the body. He wrote about anger as a kind of madness, one that disguised weakness as power. He wrote about poverty, reminding himself that lacking luxury was not the same as lacking worth. These writings were not polished performances. They were raw rehearsals for endurance. In Corsica, Seneca learned a truth that would define the rest of his life. External control is an illusion. Rome could banish him, silence him, humiliate him, but it could not force him to agree with its judgment. The only domain fully his own was his inner life. Everything else was contingent. This insight was intoxicating. For the first time, Seneca experienced a form of freedom that did not depend on favor. He had nothing to lose because everything had already been taken. Poverty ceased to be frightening. Obscurity became manageable. Even death felt less tyrannical once it was acknowledged rather than resisted. But this freedom came at a cost. Isolation sharpened his awareness of contradiction. He missed Rome, not its corruption, but its vitality. He missed conversation, argument, intellectual friction. He realized that philosophy practiced in isolation risked becoming sterile. Wisdom needed contact with the world to remain relevant. Otherwise, it curdled into self-soothing abstraction. This tension haunted him. Was he becoming wiser, or simply more resigned? Seneca's letters from exile oscillate between serenity and bitterness. One moment he preaches acceptance. The next, he rails against injustice. This was not hypocrisy. It was honesty. Exile did not turn him into a sage. It revealed the work required to become one. Years passed, Rome remained silent, but Seneca never fully stopped addressing it. His writings assumed an audience that might never return. He practiced articulating virtue as if someone, somewhere, still needed to hear it. This act itself was defiance. Rome could remove him from the city, but it could not remove the city from his mind. And then, unexpectedly, the silence broke. Agrippina, newly married to Emperor Claudius, was consolidating power. Her ambitions were surgical and precise. She did not merely want influence, she wanted permanence, secured through her son, Nero. For that, she needed legitimacy, education, philosophy, a tutor who could make a future emperor sound wise before he became powerful. She needed Seneca. The recall from exile was sudden, almost surreal. One day, Seneca was an afterthought on a forgotten island. The next, he was summoned back into the machinery that had expelled him. This reversal carried its own danger. Rome never restored someone without expecting repayment. As Seneca prepared to leave Corsica, he carried more than manuscripts and memories. He carried a philosophy forged under deprivation. He had learned how little a person truly needs, and how much compromise survival often demands. This knowledge would soon be tested, because Rome was not inviting him back as a private thinker. It was pulling him into the center of power, where ideas were no longer personal tools, but political weapons. The man who had learned inner freedom through loss was about to be handed unimaginable influence, and with it, a question that exile had postponed but never resolved. Could the freedom he found in poverty survive the return of wealth? Rome was waiting to find out. The palace was quieter than Seneca expected. Not peaceful, never that, but hushed in the way a room becomes silent when everyone is listening for footsteps. Power lived here, but it did not shout. It watched, it measured, and it remembered. When Seneca crossed back into Rome and entered the imperial household, he understood immediately that this was not a return to public life as he had known it. This was something far more intimate and far more dangerous. He was no longer addressing crowds or debating rivals. He was shaping a single mind, one that would soon command legions. Nero was 12 years old. That detail matters. History often freezes Nero in his later monstrosity, but Seneca did not meet a tyrant. He met a boy, clever, artistic, hungry for approval, and acutely aware that his life was not his own. Nero had grown up surrounded by ambition masquerading as affection. His mother, Agrippina, loved him fiercely, but her love was strategic. He was her instrument as much as her son. Seneca saw this immediately. The boy's intelligence was real, but so was his insecurity. Praise lit him up. Criticism wounded him deeply. He wanted to be admired not just as emperor in waiting, but as a person, an artist, a performer, a thinker. This longing would become catastrophic later, but at first it made him receptive. Seneca and Burrus, the stern military man appointed as Nero's co-advisor, formed an unlikely partnership. Burrus represented discipline and order. Seneca represented reason and moral language. Together, They were meant to balance the boy, to give Rome a ruler who was both strong and restrained. For a time, it worked. Seneca approached his task carefully. He did not lecture Nero about virtue as an abstract ideal. He framed it as self-mastery, the highest form of power. He praised mercy as strength, patience as superiority, restraint as elegance. He avoided Stoicism's harsher edges, knowing that severity would repel rather than attract. He wrote speeches for Nero, beautiful ones. When Nero ascended the throne at 16, his early reign felt like a miracle. Taxes were reduced, executions slowed, public games were lavish, but not cruel. The Senate was treated with respect. Rome breathed easier. People whispered that perhaps this emperor would be different. Seneca's hand was everywhere. He ghostwrote Nero's public statements, shaping imperial policy through language. When Nero spoke of clemency, it was Seneca's voice. When he promised justice, it was Seneca's reasoning. This was influence beyond any office. Philosophy translated into governance. And with influence came wealth. The rewards were immense. Land grants, gifts, opportunities that could not be refused without insult. Seneca's fortune expanded rapidly, and with it, his visibility. He became indispensable, and therefore vulnerable. The closer he stood to power, the harder it became to step away. Yet the danger was not immediate. It crept in gradually, disguised as success. Nero began to trust Seneca. Then he began to rely on him. Then, almost imperceptibly, he began to resent him. Because Seneca's presence reminded Nero of something he was slowly learning to hate: limitation. The young emperor wanted applause, not counsel. He wanted affirmation, not restraint. He wanted to perform, to sing, act, race chariots, activities Romans considered beneath imperial dignity. Seneca tried to redirect these impulses gently, framing restraint as image management rather than moral necessity. But Nero was learning a different lesson from Rome itself. The crowds adored spectacle. The palace rewarded indulgence. Power, once secured, demanded less justification. And Nero discovered that he did not need Seneca's approval to rule, only the illusion of public support. Agrippina's death marked the turning point. Whether Seneca directly approved, resisted, or simply failed to prevent it, remains debated. What matters is the aftermath. Once Nero crossed that line, something hardened in him. He had committed an unforgivable act, and survived. Worse, he had been praised for it by those who feared him. From that moment, philosophy became inconvenient. Seneca sensed the shift immediately. His advice was still heard, but no longer absorbed. Nero listened with impatience, as one listens to a former teacher whose lessons have outlived their usefulness. The balance of power had changed. Influence was now conditional, and Seneca was tired. Years at court had eroded the serenity he cultivated in exile. The compromises weighed on him. Every policy he justified felt like another debt. He began to withdraw, not dramatically, but strategically. He asked for permission to retire. Nero refused. He offered to return much of his wealth. Nero declined, interpreting the gesture as either insult or theatre. Seneca was trapped. Too rich to be innocent. Too prominent to be ignored. Too moral to be fully trusted. The philosopher who had taught inner freedom now found himself bound by external realities more tightly than ever. His wealth, once defended as morally neutral, had become a chain. His proximity to power, once a tool for good, was now a liability. And Rome, as always, was watching. Whispers grew. Accusations of hypocrisy resurfaced. now sharpened by fear. Some claimed Seneca had manipulated Nero from the beginning. Others claimed he had failed to restrain him. In Rome, failure and guilt were often indistinguishable. Seneca understood the pattern. He had seen it before, under Caligula, under Claudius. Advisors survived only as long as they remained useful and non-threatening. Once an emperor felt overshadowed, elimination followed. He began preparing himself, not politically, but philosophically. He wrote more urgently now, about death, about the inevitability of loss, about the illusion of control. His stoicism darkened, becoming less about balance and more about endurance. He was no longer teaching a student. He was bracing for an ending. The tutor of a monster is often judged by what the monster becomes. But Seneca knew a harsher truth. Philosophy can guide, but it cannot govern desire. And once desire is armed with absolute power, words become fragile things. Nero no longer needed a teacher. And Seneca, standing at the center of an empire that had outgrown his restraint, could feel the ground beginning to give way beneath him. Wealth arrived in Seneca's life the way fog rolls into a harbor. Quietly at first, then so completely that it became impossible to see where one ended and the other began. There was no single moment when Seneca decided to become rich. That is part of what makes the paradox so unsettling. His fortune accumulated through proximity, reward, and momentum. Gifts he could not refuse without offense. Estates offered as tokens of gratitude. Loans extended because refusing them would signal distrust. Each decision, taken alone, seemed reasonable. Together, they formed a life of extraordinary luxury. By the height of his power, Seneca owned multiple villas, including opulent properties near Rome and along the Campanian coast. These were not mere residences, they were statements. Marble columns, manicured gardens, libraries filled with rare texts. They were places where Rome's elite gathered to discuss virtue over wine poured by slaves. And all the while, Seneca was writing that luxury was dangerous. In his essays, he warned that comfort weakens the soul, that excess dulls gratitude, that dependence on pleasure makes a person fragile. He urged readers to practice voluntary hardship, to sleep on the floor, eat simple food, remind themselves how little was truly necessary. He even claimed to do this himself. Critics seized on this with relish. They accused him of performing poverty while bathing in wealth, of preaching simplicity from a position of total security, of using philosophy as insulation against moral scrutiny. To them, Seneca was not a sage. He was a brand. Seneca did not ignore these accusations. He addressed them directly, though never apologetically. He argued that wealth in itself was neither good nor evil. It was indifferent. What mattered was one's relationship to it. A wise man could possess riches without being possessed by them, just as a strong man could carry a heavy load without being crushed. This argument was clever and deeply controversial because it asked observers to judge not actions, but intentions, and intentions are invisible. Rome did not operate on invisible standards. It judged by appearance, by rumor, by envy. In a society where inequality was extreme and suffering omnipresent, a philosopher's fortune was not neutral, it was provocative. Every luxury Seneca enjoyed contradicted the lived reality of most Romans. And Seneca knew this. In private, he admitted discomfort. He wrote about the danger of habituation, the way abundance quietly recalibrates desire. What once felt excessive soon feels normal. What once felt sufficient begins to feel lacking. Wealth, he observed, expands appetite faster than satisfaction. This was not theoretical, it was autobiographical. The more Seneca owned, the more he felt its weight. Not guilt, exactly, but vigilance. Wealth required management, protection, justification. It entangled him in networks of obligation that philosophy alone could not dissolve. Loans created enemies. Gifts created expectations. Visibility created risk. And yet, he did not renounce it. Why? Part of the answer lies in fear. Not fear of poverty, he had endured that, but fear of suspicion. In Nero's Rome, rejecting wealth could be interpreted as moral grandstanding, a subtle accusation against the emperor himself. Returning gifts could look like rejection of favor. And rejection of favor was dangerous. Another part lies in responsibility. Seneca supported a large household, clients, dependents, freedmen. Wealth was not only personal, it was structural. To dismantle it abruptly would have harmed others and destabilized his position further. But beneath these practical reasons was something more troubling. Seneca believed he could stand inside temptation without surrendering to it. He believed that philosophy, once internalized, was strong enough to coexist with contradiction, that he could live among luxury while remaining inwardly detached. That proximity to excess did not necessarily mean corruption. This belief was sincere. It was also fragile, because detachment is easier to claim than to test, and Rome was preparing a test that no amount of self-discipline could soften. As Nero's reign darkened, wealth became more than a moral question. It became a liability. Rich men attracted attention. Attention invited accusation. Nero's paranoia grew, and with it, his appetite for confiscation. Executions were profitable. Convictions filled the treasury. Seneca's fortune, once a symbol of favor, began to look like a target. He sensed this shift and tried again to withdraw. He asked Nero for permission to retire fully, to live quietly and relinquish influence. He offered to give up much of his wealth. Nero refused, then mocked the gesture. It was too late. Withdrawal itself was now suspicious. The paradox tightened. Seneca was trapped between what he taught and what he owned, between the ideal of simplicity and the reality of entanglement, between the Stoic vision of freedom and the imperial reality of surveillance. And Rome, ruthless in its logic, was moving toward resolution, because empires do not tolerate unresolved contradictions forever. They force them into collapse. The question was no longer whether Seneca's philosophy could justify his wealth. The question was whether his wealth would cost him his life. As Nero's trust eroded and whispers of conspiracy filled the air, Seneca understood that the ultimate audit was approaching, one that would not be conducted in words but in blood. And philosophy, stripped of rhetoric and comfort, would soon be asked to stand alone. The first accusations did not arrive loudly. They never do. They drifted through Rome as insinuations, carried in private conversations and half-finished sentences. Someone would mention Seneca's wealth with a raised eyebrow. Someone else would recall a line from his essays and let it hang in the air, unfinished. Rome was expert at this kind of erosion. Reputations were not shattered. They were sanded down until nothing solid remained. Seneca felt the shift before it became visible. Invitations grew less frequent. Conversations ended more quickly when he approached. Friends measured their words. The city had begun to treat him as a risk. And in Rome, risk was contagious. At the heart of the criticism was a simple charge: hypocrisy. How could a man who preached indifference to wealth live, surrounded by luxury? How could someone who warned against power remain so close to the most dangerous power of all? These questions were not philosophical. They were political. They framed Seneca not as a thinker, but as an operator, someone who used moral language as camouflage. Seneca responded the only way he knew how, by writing. In his letters, he confronted the charge head-on. He admitted the appearance of contradiction, but rejected the conclusion. Virtue, he insisted, was not a costume stitched from circumstances. It was an internal condition. One could live in a palace and remain free, or live in poverty and remain enslaved to desire. This defense was intellectually coherent. It was also strategically disastrous, because Rome was not interested in coherence. It was interested in reassurance. And Seneca's arguments did not reassure anyone who already felt uneasy. If anything, they sharpened resentment. His critics did not want explanation. They wanted renunciation. And renunciation in Nero's Rome was no longer a safe gesture. Philosophy itself began to feel suspect. Stoicism, once admired as a framework for dignity, now looked like a language of excuse, a way for elites to rationalize survival under tyranny, to endure injustice without resisting it, to call submission wisdom and fear prudence. This interpretation spread quickly. Some accused Stoics of emotional cowardice. Others accused them of complicity. If everything external was indifferent, then what moral pressure remained to challenge cruelty? What obligation did a philosopher have to act rather than endure? Seneca was caught in this crossfire. He had never advocated passivity, but his emphasis on inner freedom was being read as withdrawal. And withdrawal, under Nero, looked like dissent. Meanwhile, Nero himself was changing. The emperor who once listened now demanded affirmation. He no longer wanted guidance. He wanted praise. He surrounded himself with flatterers and performers, men who applauded his art and excused his violence. Seneca's measured tone stood out, and not in his favor. Every attempt Seneca made to soften Nero's impulses was now interpreted as resistance. Every reminder of restraint sounded like judgment, and Nero, increasingly insecure, could not tolerate judgment. The distance between teacher and student widened. Seneca retreated further into writing, pouring urgency into his letters. He wrote about the corrosive nature of fear, about the illusion of safety under tyranny, about the need to prepare for loss before it arrives. These were not abstract reflections anymore. They were warnings, coded but unmistakable. Rome noticed. Whispers became reports. Reports became files. Files became charges. The Pisonian conspiracy, real, exaggerated, or partially invented, gave Nero what he needed: a narrative of betrayal, a justification, a cleansing fire. Seneca's name appeared on the periphery of the accusations, not as an architect, but as someone who might have known, might have sympathized, might have failed to report. In Nero's Rome, possibility was enough. Seneca understood the moment it became official. There would be no trial worth attending, no defense that mattered. Guilt was not determined by evidence, but by utility. And Seneca's utility had expired. The philosopher who had spent his life arguing that fortune was unstable now faced the most brutal confirmation of that truth. Wealth could not save him. Reputation could not shield him. Philosophy could not negotiate. What remained was character. As soldiers arrived with the order he had long anticipated, Seneca did not protest. He did not plead. He did not argue. There was nothing left to say that had not already been written. The accusations would not be answered in the Senate or in letters. They would be answered in the only arena Rome respected at the end, the manner of his death. And for the first time, the question that had followed Seneca his entire life, whether his philosophy was real or merely rhetorical, would receive a verdict that no critic could dispute. The paradox was about to be resolved, not by argument, but by choice. Power does not announce when it turns absolute. It drifts almost politely until resistance feels unnatural and obedience feels like common sense. By the time Nero fully realized he could do anything, the city had already adjusted to the idea that he might. Rome learned to anticipate his moods. What amused the emperor became law. What bored him vanished. What frightened him was destroyed. The Senate applauded. The crowds cheered. And beneath it all, fear settled into daily life like dust, unseen, unavoidable, inhaled with every breath. Seneca watched this transformation with a clarity that bordered on despair. The boy he had once guided was gone. In his place stood an emperor who saw limits as insults. Nero no longer wanted to rule Rome. He wanted Rome to reflect him. His performances grew longer. His punishments grew more theatrical. Executions became entertainment, staged to prove that power was not merely possessed, but enjoyed. And Seneca, once the voice of moderation, had become an uncomfortable reminder of an earlier self Nero wanted to forget. At first, the distancing was subtle. Fewer consultations, fewer private conversations. Nero surrounded himself with men who mirrored his appetites rather than challenged them. Advisors who laughed loudly, praised extravagantly, and asked for nothing but permission to flatter. Seneca did not belong in this world. He tried to fade into the background, believing invisibility might still be possible. He reduced his public presence. He avoided political entanglements. He spent more time at his estates, writing, preparing himself inwardly for an outcome he could now see with painful clarity. But withdrawal itself had become dangerous. In a paranoid regime, absence is interpreted as dissent. Silence is suspicion. And philosophy, especially philosophy that speaks of freedom, sounds like rebellion to ears trained to hear threat. Nero began to suspect everyone. Friends were arrested. Senators were executed. Confessions were extracted under torture, then reshaped to fit imperial narrative. Truth no longer mattered. Utility did. Fear became policy. When the Pisonian conspiracy surfaced, real or constructed, it was less an investigation than an opportunity. Nero needed enemies. Rome needed blood. The mechanism activated with brutal efficiency. Names cascaded. Some were guilty, some were not. The distinction was irrelevant. Seneca's inclusion was almost inevitable. His wealth made him visible. His philosophy made him suspect. His past influence made him dangerous. Whether he had participated in any plot mattered far less than the fact that his existence now posed a symbolic threat. A philosopher who preached inner freedom was intolerable in a state built on fear. When the order arrived, it was delivered with formal courtesy. No chains, no insults, just instructions. Seneca was permitted to choose the manner of his death, a Roman privilege reserved for elites, framed as mercy but designed to preserve the illusion of dignity. He accepted calmly. Those present were struck by his composure, not the rigid composure of denial, but the steady presence of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years. Seneca gathered his friends, his wife, and those loyal enough to remain. He spoke to them, not as a condemned man, but as a teacher delivering his final lesson. He reminded them that death was not an evil, but a necessity. That fear came not from dying, but from clinging. That a life lived in constant dread was already a kind of death. These were not rehearsed lines. They were convictions refined over decades. He opened his veins, as custom dictated. When the blood flowed too slowly, his body weakened by illness and age, he drank poison. When even that failed to act quickly, he entered a warm bath, accelerating the end. Each step was deliberate. Each choice was consistent with the philosophy he had articulated for a lifetime. Rome would not deny him this final coherence. News of his death spread quickly. Some mourned sincerely, others feigned grief. Many said nothing at all. The city absorbed the event the way it absorbed everything else, with appetite, then forgetfulness. Nero attended performances that evening, and yet something lingered. Seneca's death did not silence his words. It sharpened them. Critics who once dismissed him as a hypocrite now faced an uncomfortable fact. When forced to choose between life and integrity, he chose integrity. Wealth could not save him. Power could not excuse him. Philosophy did not rescue him, but it did guide him to the end. The student had become the emperor, and the teacher had become a memory. But Rome, for all its brutality, could not erase the contradictions Seneca embodied. A man who lived inside wealth while warning against it, who served power while questioning it, who survived compromise until compromise demanded his soul. The question now shifted. Not whether Seneca had failed to stop Nero, but whether anyone ever could. Because the true horror of Nero's reign was not that one man became a monster, but that an entire civilization adjusted to it, applauded it, explained it away. Seneca had tried to teach Rome restraint from within its most dangerous circle. He had failed. But in failing, he left behind something far more enduring than policy or influence. He left a record of what it costs to remain human under absolute power. And Rome, despite itself, would carry that record far beyond the life of the emperor who tried to erase it. The order had already been carried out, but Rome was not finished with Seneca. Death in an empire like Rome's was never merely an ending, it was a message. And Nero intended Seneca's to be read carefully. The manner of the philosopher's death was meant to demonstrate imperial mercy, permission granted, dignity preserved. But beneath the ceremony was a warning to anyone who still believed that intellect or virtue provided protection. Seneca had been the closest thing Rome had to a moral compass at the center of power. If even he could be removed, no one was untouchable. Yet the message did not land the way Nero intended, because something unexpected happened in the days that followed. Seneca's composure in death became the story. Not the conspiracy, not the emperor's vigilance, not the supposed betrayal. Romans began to whisper not about Nero's strength, but about Seneca's calm. In a culture that prized spectacle, Seneca's restraint was itself a spectacle. Accounts of his final hours circulated, how he comforted others instead of seeking comfort, how he spoke of philosophy without bitterness, how he treated death as an obligation fulfilled rather than a punishment endured. These details mattered. They suggested that Seneca had not been surprised by the end, that he had been preparing for it all along. This realization unsettled people. If Seneca was right, if death was not the ultimate horror, then fear lost its leverage, and fear was the currency of Nero's rule. Philosophy, in that sense, outlived the philosopher. It slipped past the guards, the edicts, the executions, and lodged itself in the minds of those who heard the story. Seneca's writings took on new weight. Passages once dismissed as rhetorical flourishes now read like instructions. His insistence on rehearsing death no longer sounded morbid, it sounded practical. His warnings about the instability of fortune felt prophetic. His arguments for inner freedom appeared less like abstraction and more like resistance. Even critics were forced to recalibrate. Yes, he had been wealthy. Yes, he had compromised. Yes, he had lived inside the system he criticized. But when the system demanded submission at the final moment, he refused. That refusal mattered. It complicated the charge of hypocrisy in a way no defense ever could. Seneca had paid the price. This did not turn him into a saint. It turned him into a problem. A more dangerous one than before. A dead philosopher could not be threatened. His ideas could not be coerced, and now they carried the authority of example. Rome responded the only way it knew how. Nero attempted to control the narrative. He continued his performances, his excesses, his purges. He acted as though Seneca had been a minor inconvenience, already forgotten. But the more he tried to dominate memory, the more it slipped away from him. The great fire would come soon. So would Nero's fall. History, ruthless in its symmetry, would not be kind to him. Seneca, meanwhile, began his second life. His works survived because they were useful. Monks copied them centuries later, finding in Stoic discipline a structure for Christian asceticism. Renaissance humanists rediscovered his prose and admired its psychological precision. Enlightenment thinkers quoted him while arguing about liberty and reason. Modern readers found in his letters a voice that spoke across time, intimate, urgent, uncomfortably honest. What endured was not the image of a flawless sage. It was the image of a man wrestling with contradiction. Seneca did not resolve the paradox of wealth and virtue. He lived inside it. He tested it. He exposed its limits. And when the test became absolute, he met it without flinching. This is why his story refuses to settle into moral simplicity. He was not a hypocrite who happened to die well. Nor was he a pure philosopher tragically corrupted by power. He was something far more disturbing. A realist who understood that moral clarity often emerges only at the edge of loss. The price of integrity, Seneca showed, is not purity. It is preparedness. Preparedness to lose reputation, preparedness to lose security. Preparedness to lose life itself without surrendering the self. That was the standard he set. Not for emperors, but for anyone trapped in a system that rewards silence and punishes restraint. In the end, Rome could take everything from Seneca, except the one thing he had trained himself never to depend on. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous lesson of all. Because an empire can survive rebels. What it cannot survive are people who are no longer afraid. Long after the torches of Nero's Rome burned out, Seneca kept speaking, not as a voice preserved in marble or law, but as a presence that reappeared wherever power and conscience collided. Empires fell. Religions rose. Languages transformed. Yet his words resurfaced again and again, unsettling new generations that believed they had finally solved the problem of wealth, power, and virtue. This persistence is not accidental. Seneca survived because he never offered comfort without cost. His philosophy does not flatter. It does not promise happiness. It does not claim that good intentions redeem bad systems. What it offers instead is a mirror, one that reflects not who we want to be, but who we are when circumstances strip away excuses. Early Christian thinkers found him disturbingly familiar. His emphasis on inner freedom, moral discipline, and contempt for excess sounded almost like scripture. Legends even emerged claiming he had corresponded with the Apostle Paul. They had not, but the myth itself is revealing. Seneca's Stoicism felt like a bridge between pagan Rome and Christian morality, a reminder that ethical struggle did not begin with revelation, nor end with empire. In medieval monasteries, his letters were copied by candlelight, not because monks admired Roman luxury, but because they recognized the discipline beneath the contradiction. Seneca wrote about self-command in a world hostile to restraint. Monks lived it in a world hostile to silence. Different settings, same struggle. During the Renaissance, Seneca was reborn again, this time as a stylist. His sharp prose, emotional intensity, and psychological depth appealed to a culture rediscovering the individual. Artists, statesmen, and writers quoted him not as a saint, but as a guide through moral ambiguity. He spoke to people who knew that purity was impossible, but responsibility was not. And then came the modern age. Capitalism, bureaucracy, corporate power, systems more abstract than Nero's Rome, but no less demanding of compromise. Seneca slipped easily into this world. CEOs quoted him on resilience. Soldiers read him before deployment. Therapists echoed his insights without naming the source. His language of internal control and external chaos felt unnervingly current. This is where the paradox sharpens again. Why does a billionaire philosopher resonate in an age of billionaires? Because Seneca never pretended wealth was harmless. He warned that it rewires perception, that it quietly teaches dependence, that it creates a false sense of safety that collapses at the first real test. His critics were right about one thing. It is easier to praise poverty from comfort than from hunger. Seneca knew that too. That is why he insisted on voluntary discomfort, not as performance, but as training. Train before you are tested. That was the core of his message. Seneca did not ask people to renounce wealth. He asked them to imagine losing it, honestly, repeatedly, without melodrama, to rehearse disgrace, to make peace with mortality, to strip power of its greatest weapon, fear. This is why his legacy remains uncomfortable. He does not fit cleanly into moral categories. He cannot be celebrated without reservation or dismissed without unease. He forces a question that never goes away. Regardless of era or ideology, what would happen to you if everything you rely on vanished tomorrow? For Seneca, this was not a thought experiment. It was a lived reality. First in illness, then in exile, then in proximity to tyranny, and finally in death. Each stage refined his understanding of freedom. Not freedom as independence from constraint, but freedom as non-dependence on what can be taken. This is the reason the charge of hypocrisy ultimately fails. Hypocrisy requires comfort with contradiction. Seneca was never comfortable. He was vigilant, anxious, self-critical. His writings are filled with admissions of failure, reminders to himself, warnings written as much for the author as for the reader. He did not present himself as an example of perfection, but as a case study in struggle. A billionaire who preached poverty was not trying to escape judgment. He was trying to survive temptation. And perhaps that is why his story still matters. Because most people do not live in monasteries or deserts. They live inside systems they did not design, benefiting from arrangements they cannot fully justify, trying to act decently without pretending innocence. Seneca offers no absolution. He offers preparation. He tells us that the world will test us, not once, but constantly. That power will seduce. That comfort will soften. That fear will whisper rationalizations. And that the only defense is an inner posture developed long before crisis arrives. Rome thought it had silenced him. Instead, it turned him into a long echo, one that follows anyone who stands too close to power and asks whether they still recognize themselves. And that is the final paradox. Seneca did not defeat the empire that killed him. He outlasted it. Because empires command bodies, but only ideas, tested, costly, and unfinished, command time.